To begin our first keynote speaker, we are joined online all the way from the USA by Reverend Joan Halifax. Reverend is the founder and head teacher of Upaya Zen Center in Santa Fe, New Mexico, a social activist, author, and in her early years was an anthropologist. She is a pioneer in the field of end of life care, and has lectured on the subject of death and dying at many academic institutions and medical centers around the world. Reverend's talk today will explore the topic of Bodhisattvas serving in the Charnel Grounds, 7 keys to meeting today's world suffering. Please join me in welcoming Reverend Joan Halifax.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm so grateful to be with you today, and also want to say that I was very moved by the chanting and also the meditation. Wonderful, really wonderful. I also have to thank my teachers, Thich Nhat Hanh and Roshi Bernie Glassman. You know, they were Zen teachers who were so dedicated to the practice of engaged Buddhism. And they're both gone now. But I think many of us realize that their courageous approach to Buddhism has touched people all over the world. You know, in the mid-1960s, a young Vietnamese monk came to America to ask us to cease bombing his country. And when I encountered Thai in New York, I realized 3 important things. And the first was, I too was suffering. And the second was I could be a contemplative and a social activist. And the third thing was, it was so moving for me listening to Thai. And also, it undid a kind of bind that had held me in its grip for so many years. And that was the kind of pragmatic approach that Buddhism offers us in terms of a path out of social and environmental suffering and personal suffering. So thank you. And I want to just touch into something about the charnel ground. And this notion, of course, is in many aspects of Buddhism. What is it to practice in the charnel ground? What does it mean to be in a place where the dead are decaying in your very presence? And I think that that sensibility and that experience is something that brought my beloved last Zen teacher, Bernie Glassman, to this notion of charnel ground practice. And I see that the wonderful person who introduced me mentioned how important it is that we understand the deep roots of Buddhism today, but we also, at the same time, try to ground Buddhism within the present experience, whatever that may be. And I'm remembering a wonderful exchange between the 10th century Rinzai teacher, Shushan, and a monk. And Shushan was asked, what is a bodhisattva before she becomes a Buddha? And Shushan replied, all beings. And then the monk said, well, what about after she becomes a Buddha? And Shushan replied, well, all beings, all beings. Historically, I think all of us know that the Buddha did not hold himself apart from social suffering that was present at the time. And he also engaged in revolutionary acts of compassion. He flattened out the racist caste system in his community. He ordained untouchables and women. He sat with a dying monk. He ordained a transformed serial killer and more. And though sometimes this is not very emphasized in conventional Buddhism or general Buddhism, it's become a kind of lens through which I see the life of the Buddha as being not only a contemplative, but also being a social activist. And we know that the Bodhisattva ideal, it's deep in the earth of early Buddhism. For example, the term Bodhisattva in early Buddhism refers to Buddha in his previous lives and also as a young person in his last life when he was moving towards awakening. And the Jataka tales of early Buddhism were a powerful incubator for the later Mahayana unfolding of the Bodhisattva ideal. And I think many forget this, is that these stories that often, are told to children, but we also study. It's one of these things where you realize that the Bodhisattva ideal was seeded to some extent in a very unusual way by these Jataka stories. And most Buddhist traditions agree that to realize awakening it's really necessary to actualize the paramitas of generosity, as we heard from Venerable Tenzin, of integrity, which is something I'm sure is the very heart of the Metta family, of patience, of wholeheartedness, of concentration and wisdom. And these are just 6 of the paramitas, but of course there are in some schools 10. And that's how we actualize the Bodhisattva ideal, truly, as a kind of path of discovery, as a context of practice, and also the sense of social responsibility, of social transformation. And there are some other interesting aspects of the Bodhisattva ideal that I think are rather valuable to explore. And these are the ones that I have kind of studied or conjured, particularly at this time as we are in the grip of a very complex polycrisis. And how the Bodhisattva ideal might be mobilized as a force for social and environmental good. Now, we know that this Bodhisattva ideal emerged during the Mahayana movement around the 1st century BCE, but when monks, nuns, and lay followers began to devote themselves to the Bodhisattva path, a path which, of course, I see reflected within the context of your organization, a path that's open to everyone. So looking at this compassionate mind, focusing on awakening for the sake of all beings, we come to understand it's the fundamental and defining element of the Bodhisattva ideal and path. And today, like is reflected in your organization, many of the schools of Mahayana Buddhism deeply encourage the cultivation of an altruistic motivation, and also the importance of receiving the Bodhisattva vows. And I like what Roshi Norman Fisher has shared, that the Bodhisattva attitude is an attitude that is unshakable in terms of clarity, and it reflects our very character, what it means to be upright, to be trustworthy. It reflects our stance, our point of view, and Norman has said, it's the internal atmosphere that colors our very way of seeing the world. And I add that it is saturated by appamada, by care, by conscientiousness, and by compassion. So this is the brief introduction into these aspects of the Bodhisattva ideal from the point of view of what might serve us in this complex time that we're in. They're kind of enriching powers or perspectives, attitudes that foster, I feel, not only individual transformation, but also social and environmental transformation. And the first one is fostering interconnected communities of integrity and care. And it's a perspective that is about inclusion, which again, your organization has actualized. It's about intimacy. It's about what Kaz, or Tai rather, reflected in his notion of interbeing. It's reflected as well in solidarity and in moral character. You know, Tai suggested the coming Buddha is the Sangha. That is interbeing. And forgive my coughing. I was on an airplane recently, and needless to say, I picked up a little something. But let's go back to this wondrous notion of the power of community. My own teacher called it one body. Tai called it interbeing. It is really important that we actualize strong communities of solidarity who work together with other communities in order to really face the truth of suffering in our world today. The wars, the genocides, the complexity in our medical system, authoritarianism, and so forth. A long list of issues that are really important for us to understand. Community is the medium, and interconnected communities are a medium for facing these various forms of suffering and toward working together for the ending of suffering. Another valence or aspect that I'd like to mention is of hope, but that hope is not conventional that I'm speaking about. I'm speaking more about wise hope. You know, it's a hope that is selfless. It's a hope that is non-transactional. It's also a hope that's not attached to outcomes. And that's why I've called it wise hope. And years ago, I read some words by the Czech statesman Václav Havel, and he said, hope is not the conviction that something will turn out well, but the certainty that something makes sense, regardless of how it turns out. And I feel like wise hope of the Bodhisattvas shows us that what we do really matters, even though how it may matter, even though when it may matter, or whom it may impact, or whom it may touch. We recognize when we are in that spirit of wise hope that it matters. And there are things that we can't know beforehand, but we know that our actions, how we live, what we care about, what we care for, and how we care really do matter, no matter the outcome. Another valence that I think is important for us to touch into is that the Bodhisattva is at home in the midst of uncertainty. I mean, the Bodhisattva realizes that our lived experience is characterized by fundamental precariousness. The Bodhisattva rests in not knowing and lives in the fundamental experience of openness, of just this sense of beginner's mind. It's really hard to do that for many of us very educated. And the result is that we rely on prescriptions, proscriptions. We rely on the sense of knowing or of facts. Our identities are often deeply rooted within this knowing. And this aspect of the Bodhisattva way is pretty radical to consider, particularly for Western individuals. How do I rest in not knowing? The next valence that I want to touch into is Bodhisattvas don't seek easy situations, and they live without fear. And this is very much related to what I was speaking about in terms of the Bodhisattvas rest in not knowing. In a certain way, knowing is a strategy that the ego devises in order to diminish fear. I also spoke earlier about Glassman Roshi and charnel ground practice. This is really important for us to look at. Bodhisattvas, in my experience, from my perspective, practice fearlessly in the ground of suffering. And from, what all of you represent, suffering is pervasive. And it's very important to understand that it is not only to rest in the truth of suffering and its causes, but also that beings can be free of suffering. I live in that sensibility in terms of wise hope, going back to that valence. How important it is to understand we cannot control outcomes, but what we do matters. And being able to practice in this kind of ground of suffering, well, bodhisattvas fundamentally go to where suffering is the worst, the most heartbreaking, where life itself is truly precarious, whether it's the surgeon's cold theater or the hot theater of war. Bodhisattvas come alive in the death camps. They see the light under the bridges where the unsheltered huddle to escape torrential rains. Some years ago, I was in Dharamsala moderating a science meeting on behalf of His Holiness and the Mind and Life Institute. And His Holiness emphasized again and again that we are one human community and how important warm-heartedness is. He said, the cure for despair, the cure for futility and of hopelessness is cultivating an altruistic heart. And I so appreciated his perspective because also being with neuroscientists in that meeting, there was so much evidence in neuroscience and social psychology about the benefits of compassion, of conscientiousness, of altruism. And it benefits not only those whom one serves, it benefits also those who observe compassion, for example, and altruism. but it also benefits those who actualize compassion. And I found His Holiness's words so deeply inspiring. I was thinking about his exile, the many years in exile, now 90 years old, never being able to return to his country. The deaths of so many Tibetan people, as a result of occupation, and how he had managed to transform the tragic circumstances of his life. And he did it by not turning away from suffering. And I reflect on people like Nelson Mandela and Malala, Jane Goodall, so many others. The way out of their suffering, the way out of oppression, the way out of loss was on the path of caring so deeply for others. And then this fifth valence that I want to share. And this I refer to just now. This is the actualization of compassion. And it's not just common compassion toward our in-group, toward our family. And it's not just dharmically based, which is really important as well. But actually, it's what Matthieu Ricard has called universal compassion. It's about an expression of compassion that is fundamentally spontaneous, it's seamless. Importantly, it's non-transactional, it's unprescribed and responsive to the truth of suffering in whatever form it takes. I think that's why there isn't compassion burnout. This is a term that was, articulated for a good reason, but not understanding the actual potency of universal compassion. In the next Bodhisattva valence that I want to just briefly, and this is, I'm kind of going through these rather quickly, and forgive me, because I want to honor your lunchtime at the top of the hour. But this is a wonderful perspective offered by my good friend, Rebecca Solnit, and she wrote about revolutionary joy. And she wrote about it in relation to those of us who are social activists. And she said, joy doesn't betray, it actually sustains activism. And when you face a politics that aspires to make you fearful, alienated, and isolated, joy is a fine initial act of insurrection. So one might say bodhisattvas are insurrectionists. They're joyful insurrectionists in some way. That even in the midst of the work of transforming suffering, a bodhisattva comes from a wellspring of joy. And I'm thinking about the work of Dacher Keltner, who recognizes joy that arises literally from moral beauty. It's a wonderful term, moral beauty. And it refers to the unselfconscious acts of virtue that inspire awe in others. And I think this is really important to understand. We're not doing this work in service to others and to the environment in order to get something or to enhance our identity. We just do it naturally in a prescribed way, as I said about compassion, non-prescriptive, non-transactional. But actually, we experience joy in the happiness and good fortune of others, and we work, or bodhisattvas work, to actualize this great gift. So I'm just thinking of Shantideva. You know, it's hard not to bring Shantideva to mind when he wrote, you know, bodhisattvas are happy even when undergoing terrible torture. And he said, you know, all who are happy in this world are happy because of desire for others' happiness. This is what the Bodhisattva offers, and it's reflected in a certain way by the writing of my good friend Terry Tempest Williams. And she said, you know, we can remake our vows to not only find beauty in a broken world, but to create beauty in the world we find. To create beauty, no matter what it is we're encountering. I mean, this is the actualization of the heart and the spirit of bodhisattvas. And the last power I want to just touch into, or valence, or quality, or landscape, is that of imagination. And it's about the generosity of the mind that is free from narrow views. Free from narrow views. I'm recalling a koan by Baizhang about the gateway to the Bodhisattva path. And Baizhang answered, it is because to practice giving is to practice letting go. And a monk asked, well, what do you let go of? And Baizhang said, you let go of narrow views. You let go of the idea that things are small and tight and graspable and possessible. I think it takes great imagination to let go of narrow views and to open the heart and mind to its natural abundance, its natural state of generosity. One of the precepts that we take in our school of Buddhism is do not foster a mind of poverty in yourself or others. Do not foster a mind of poverty in yourself or of others. You know, it's having the imagination, like in the spirit of wise hope, to be open to the best of all possibilities. A mind that is fundamentally generous, one that's full of potential, one that's full of empathy, one that is free, if you will, from constricting and fearful views. And, you know, I think we're all aware of the effect, for example, on media, on social media, on really feeding fear. And again, it's recognizing that and turning toward one's own natural abundance and the natural abundance, potentialities within others. And I know even in my own work with dying people and on death row in the penitentiary of New Mexico, you know, working in what seemed to be hopeless situations, or my years of being a civil rights activist, an anti-war activist, you think this is never going to end. There's no way out. But one has to drop beneath that dimension of despair and hopelessness and to realize anything can happen, the worst or the best, and be open and work toward the actualization of the best. So this Bodhisattva ideal, which I've referenced here now in relation to, and I'm just going to check time, in relation to community, in relation to wise hope, in relation to revolutionary joy, in relation to compassion. You know, this is about being authentic, about being real. It's also about being raw, willing to be in the situations where rawness is really present. It also means being free of views and having the courage, if you will, to be intimate, deeply connected to what is arising in this moment, and also being willing to be broken apart and to repair oneself and to repair each other. It's about having the imagination to seeing things as not necessarily perfect, but really as complete, as whole. So in our Sangha, at night, but also on many other occasions, we chant the 4 great vows of the Bodhisattvas. And as I kind of conclude my talk, again, apologizing for my cough, but I'm sure you can understand. I won't chant, but I'd like to share those vows with you. And then the night chant that we hear every evening as we conclude session. Creations are numberless. I vow to free them. Delusion are inexhaustible. I vow to transform them. Reality is boundless. I vow to perceive it. The awakened way is unsurpassable. I vow to embody it. And then the night chant. Let me respectfully remind you, life and death are of supreme importance. Time passes swiftly and opportunity is lost. Let us awaken. Awaken. Do not squander your life. So thank you very much. I think we're just in time where you all can enjoy a lunch, and also reflecting on the introductory remarks and chanting of our friends, and also perhaps a little of what I've shared might be interesting or helpful for you. And thank you so much for your practice and your dedication.
Thank you, Reverend, for that profound talk. So many precious gems in there. Not turning away from our suffering, meeting it with compassion. And I really resonate with the teachings of that Bodhisattva, resting in not knowing, which is kind of tricky today, right? Beginner's mind, openness. And we can certainly practice that now as we rest in not knowing what lunch will be.